So in today's session, we're going to be looking at file systems and how files are managed on file systems. In our previous lessons, we looked at some basic commands in Linux, and some of the commands were how to move within directories, and then also how to see items within a directory. And these commands helped us to do other stuff. I think at the end of the day, we were able to create a simple script that was doing something. So in this session, we're going to go a bit deeper. Now, when we talk about files, one of the most important part of files is how you manage it. So for files, every file will come with an attribute. And one thing about files is the fact that in Linux, everything is considered a file. So when we talk about files in Linux, we're talking about anything in the operating system. In other operating systems like Windows, there's a distinction, but with Linux, everything within the Linux operating system is handled like a file, even though we have different types of files, but everything is handled like a file. And every file would have an attribute or some specific attributes other than the name. So I'm sure once upon a time you've created a file before, maybe you've given it a name. So let's say in our previous session, we had a file which was try.sh, which was more like a script or a bash file. Now, this file has some attributes that we're not seeing here, but the only thing we see here is the name. But that's not the only attribute that comes to that file. One of the attributes that is not too clear here would be who owns this file or who created this file. Another attribute may be what kind of stuff can the owner do on the file, or what kind of people can access the same file. When was the file created? So stuff like that are what we're going to be looking at with the file systems. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, even though we're saying that files will have various attributes, these attributes are not going to be the same for every single file. The attributes may vary, even though they can have all these attributes, but they may vary. And the attributes, the way they've been positioned or they've been created, would have a direct effect on how you can access that file. So a typical example would be some files will allow a user to read the file. Some files will allow a user to read and write to the file. Some files will allow a user to just execute the file. So depending on what is configured or what kind of attributes are set at a particular point in time, a file can be having a particular effect on your system. Now, again, files have various permissions, and the permissions will depend on the kind of attributes that are set. So later on, we'll get to see that we have two main types of permissions: who the users are, and then also what they can do. So these are the various permissions: who the users are and what they can do. If I'm trying to draw a parallel with what we'll be doing in the future when we get to cloud, we'll be looking at something called the IAM, so which is identity access management. We can draw a parallel now. So identity access management. Let's draw the parallel. The identity here will be the who has access to this file. The access here will be what they can do. So basically the same thing applies to any normal file in how do you call it, the file systems here. So let's just look at something brief on our file system. So in this session, we'll look at two things: the permission levels and then the applications. So when we talk about permission levels, we're talking about the kind of users. And when we talk about application level, we're talking about the kind of access. All right, so file permissions. So we have two main types of permissions in our file management systems in Linux. So the permission, like I said earlier, will determine who and how a file can be accessed or used. So the types of permission that we have on a file, the first one is the permission levels, as I mentioned earlier on, and the second one is application level. Now, when we talk about the permission levels, that would determine who or what kind of identity can access a file. It's just the identity. So we have three main levels. The first level is the user or owner level. So basically, the user or owner level ideally will be the person who created the file. So when we say who created a file, which account was the file created in? So assuming with what we were using from last week. We were using the OS boxes, and OS boxes was the user. And so if within that OS boxes account, which we'll see shortly, if that account is used to create a file, say attach file name underscore name, maybe .txt, what it means is that this file, because it was created by this account, which is called OS boxes, will be the owner or the user of that particular file. Now, in the previous session, we also mentioned that once you create a user, that user is tied to a particular group, and by default, the primary group of every user is the same as the name of the user. So if you go back to the previous session, you see that if we created a user called OS boxes, that's the name of the user. And at the same time, there is a default group which is created, also called OS boxes. And so at this point, the user for this particular account is still going to be OS boxes. And then the group is also going to be OS boxes. But you can also create multiple groups and then assign different users into those groups. Again, when we saw users and groups, we said that with groups are created to give specific roles or specific access to the kind of things they can do or files they can access. And so in the near future, when we get to user management, this is just file management. When we get to user management, we realize that we'll create multiple users, and then we'll assign some of these users to certain groups, and those groups will be assigned certain roles and permissions. And so anybody within that particular group would be only able to do specific things that have been assigned to that particular group. So that's very important. That's one of the things why we say that when you're using Linux, it's very, very good and flexible. At the same time, for security reasons, it's one of the ideal ones because you can easily manage users and groups without using any external file.